Today on Ask Money Talk, we answer a question about taxes and owning U.S. assets. Mindi Banach, tax and estate planner, TD Wealth, joins us now to weigh in. Here's the question for you, Mindi. What exactly is a U.S. situs asset? I hear I may have to pay U.S. estate tax on those, even if I'm Canadian. What do we think?
So what exactly are U.S. situs assets? U.S. situs assets are those assets that are essentially connected to the United States. So for example, U.S. real estate property, U.S. stock, ownership of U.S.-based corporations. Essentially, if an asset is located in the United States and is some way tied to the United States, it may likely be considered a U.S. situs asset. Now, one common misconception that Canadians have is that if they own their U.S. securities within Canadian registered accounts like RSPs, RIFs, and TFSAs, then they don't own any U.S. situs asset. That's not true. If you do own U.S. stock within your Canadian registered accounts, you do own U.S. situs assets. And when you own U.S. situs assets, you need to be aware of the possible U.S. estate tax implications. Now, what is the U.S. estate tax? The U.S. estate tax is the U.S. jurisdictional's way of taxing its people essentially at death. Now, I like to compare it to the system that we have here in Canada. Now, at death in Canada, we have this concept of the deemed disposition at death, which a lot of people may be familiar about, which essentially the Canadian government, they pretend to sell all of your assets at the fair market value on the day of your passing, and you typically have to pay taxes on any of the associated gains, the capital gain tax. The U.S., different country, they obviously have a entirely different tax regime. They have the U.S. estate tax regime, which taxes its people on the fair market value of the worldwide net worth of a U.S. person. Now, a lot of Canadians think, well, I'm not a U.S. person, I shouldn't be subjected to the U.S. estate tax. And, part of that is true, but it's not entirely true, because the reality is the U.S., rightfully so, does have jurisdiction over, again, its U.S. situs assets. So if a Canadian owns U.S. situs assets, they need to look into whether or not they will have U.S. estate tax implications.
All right, we understand what we're talking about now. Something you said there plays nicely into the next question. Does a Canadian have to pay U.S. estate tax on all of their U.S. assets?
So it really depends. And I really want to distinguish between the filing obligation that someone has in order to file a U.S. estate tax return, because even as a Canadian, if you merely own $60,000 US of U.S. situs assets, you may have, again, a filing obligation to file something called a U.S. estate tax return, but that does not automatically mean that you will have to owe and or pay U.S. estate tax. To determine if you have to pay U.S. estate tax, you need to look at the exemptions that you are eligible for. Now, all non-residents of the United States are eligible for an exemption, but Canadians get a little bit of an added advantage in that under the U.S.-Canada tax treaty, there's an additional exemption available for Canadians, and it is subject to inflation each year, also U.S. legislation. So depending on how much of an exemption that you qualify for, the exemption may be higher than the estate tax that you owe.
All right, we get deeper into our understanding. I think the next natural question someone watching might have is, how can you potentially reduce your liabilities when it comes to that U.S. estate tax?
So this is where, before I even mention any strategies, I have a caveat that I want to mention, and that is you really need to get the proper advice before you deal with any strategy to mitigate U.S. estate tax, because even if you are able to mitigate, reduce, and or avoid U.S. estate tax, these strategies come with other pitfalls, other implications to consider. So what are some of the common strategies we see? Well, one strategy is gifting the U.S. situs assets away. However, you also need to be concerned about if you're trying to reduce, the U.S. situs that you own at death subject to U.S. estate tax, and you gift too much money during your lifetime, you may be subject to something called the U.S. gift tax regime, which is not something that we have here in Canada, but again, something that they have in the United States, so be aware of that. You also may want to consider owning your U.S. situs assets under a Canadian trust. In that circumstance, you may no longer own U.S. situs assets. If you're married to a U.S. person, there are certain spousal exemptions that you may want to ensure that you are eligible for, as well as I mentioned before, that U.S.-Canada tax treaty. You want to leverage that exemption that you qualify for to ensure that perhaps you're not being subjected to pay any U.S. estate tax.
Some strategies there. Obviously, as you said, it is complex. It sounds like speaking to a professional could be really helpful here.
Yeah, and I encourage clients to look for Canadian professional advisor, whether that's a lawyer, a tax advisor, an investment advisor. You know, having a license on both sides of the border, US and Canada, can be an added value, but not necessarily a requirement. I encourage, if you're a Canadian and you need Canadian documents drafted, you obviously need a Canadian lawyer, but who has knowledge and familiarity with the US implications for Canadians.
Very enlightening as always. Thanks for that, Mindi.
My pleasure.
That was Mindi Banach, tax and estate planner at TD Wealth. And if you have a question, send it to moneytalk@td.com.